Hello, this is Jerry Orr reporting for ArtStation, and right now we are with Chris Wren and Dave Sanderson, and Chris is the head of XDI events at Electronic Arts, and Dave is the external development manager at Phoenix Labs, and they are the co-authors of the XDS Insight Report for 2021. And for people who don't know, XDS Insight is an annual report that takes a look at the trends of the external development world for game development. And not only that, XDS also has a yearly conference called XDS Summit. It's the biggest of its kind. It's all about external development. The 2021 conference is happening between September 14th and September 17th. For more information about it, go to xdssummit.com. Thank you guys so much for being here. To get started, let's just quickly talk about a little bit more what XDS is and in general what external development is. Chris, can you briefly describe both?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say, Jerry, on behalf of Dave and I, thank you so much for having us today. This is fantastic. I'm a big fan of ArtStation. I think it's a really important thing that, for our games industry. And whenever I've traveled around to different countries and different conferences, people are always excited to show me their individual portfolios on ArtStation and their company portfolios. So yeah, I'm a big fan and really honored to have the opportunity today. So I'll start by just talking very briefly. I'll try to not go down any rabbit holes on what external development is. And it's essentially the practice of, Dave and I both work for developers. I work for a developer publisher. I'm also the chair of the XDS Advisory Committee. And the practice of external development is essentially a developer taking advantage of the services that a third-party company might provide. Because, and we're going to get into this more in the interview, I'm sure, but our games are getting much larger, much more complex. New platforms come online, and oftentimes we simply don't have the capabilities or the resources in-house to be able to field this work ourselves. So we really rely on the horsepower of these external partners that effectively become extensions of our teams to help build this content, build these game modes and feed back into the larger product. And it's a very, very prevalent practice. I'd be hard pressed, I think, to find, a developer publisher that's not doing some element of that today. Dave, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
I think that's a great summary, and I think you're exactly right that external development is it's not a novel concept, and it's not some new thing. It is how games are made. To Chris's point, I would be very surprised if there are any games of any significant size that are produced without some degree of external development in this day of age. And I think that's ultimately to the great benefit of players around the world. Just the quality of content that's able to be produced is just, it goes up and up and up, and that's supported by the ability of great teams to work with other great teams around the world.
Yeah, the prevalence. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, you go. Oh, please, Jerry.
The prevalence of external development is made very clear in the report. I just want to list some statistics here for people who are curious. 55% of developers use more than 10 different service providers, which itself seems like a lot to be working with. But not only that, 65% of developers say they spend more than $1 million in outsourcing. I mean, it's clear that it's large, it's very common, it's all over the place. And I think a big question is, and Chris, you briefly touched upon this, is why external development over internal development? Why not have these resources and this labor in-house instead of looking at other companies?
Yeah, so I had Dave agree or disagree with me, but I don't feel like it's a choice anymore for most of us. I feel like it's now a necessity. Before I get into that though, Jerry, you asked me earlier about our XDS event, and I'm sorry, I forgot to give a quick overview on that. So we do have this event called the External Development Summit, XDS. It entirely focuses on the theme of external dev. And, almost 10 years ago, we, my team and others like me in the industry, Dave, we'd go to other, games industry events, and it was really hard to find any content, any knowledge around this subject of external development. And it was almost harder to find the companies, the service providers that can support us on that front. So we took this leadership, step about 10 years ago and decided to, give XDS to the video game industry, and that bringing together folks like ourselves on the developer publisher side, as well as bringing the service providers together. And the idea is, of course, to share knowledge across across the industry, to bring these folks together to find, business opportunities and matching opportunities, and essentially, the end goal being to advance the ecosystem and to raise all ships. So that's why we did that. And 10 years later, I think we've got a really successful thing going. And of course, Dave is also a member of that advisory committee. So coming back to your question, Jerry, yeah, I don't think it's much of a choice anymore. I do think it's a necessity. Again, games getting larger, games getting more complex. Even things like live ops, like live operations, are now starting to go out of house and being supported by companies. But what I'll also add to that is to say, like, that obviously doesn't eliminate the need for having good, smart people like in-house. Like, I don't think that's ever going to go away. And it really, what it allows is like the core teams internally, when you work for a developer or publisher, to focus on the design and to focus on product quality and set the targets that then get cascaded to the external partners. And so that internal team kind of remains as the brain trust for the product. Although again, in some cases, even that creative thinking is starting to go out of house now as well.
The thing I would add to that is, Jerry, when you were, you said, why do it externally and not internally? And I think it's important to recognize that it's not an either or question. The answer is usually both, not only for the reasons that Chris described in terms of having product owners or vision holders inside a studio, but often the needs of a developer shift over the life cycle of a product being developed, and there are often experts who are really well suited to certain portions of that pipeline, and having them internally may not actually be in their best interests, and it may not actually allow them to do their best work. So a really easy example of that, as it relates to ArtStation, is if a game is in early concepting phases, artists who are particularly good at design exploration, like they're not zeroing in on a style guide, they're not working to brand, but they're just trying to ideate in a really wide way. Those people are particularly valuable early on in the development process. And if you're working at a game studio that's taking 3-4 years to make a game, they have a ton of work to do at the beginning and decreasing amounts of work to do as the product matures. And so the ability for an individual contractor or perhaps a studio of artists to jump from project to project around the world onto new things allows them to hone their craft, allows them to work on interesting projects, and really allows more interesting ideas to get out into the world. So I don't think it's a question necessarily of like, why don't those developers just hire them? Often it's more about like, how do you find the best possible people for the right job at the right time? And that's true, I think, pretty much across the board for external development. It's particularly true when it comes to artists.
And Jerry, if I could just jump in, I know like Dave and I think probably multiple times throughout this conversation are going to reference art, because like that's just a very prevalent area that tends to go out of house, and was probably one of the first that really started it off like 10, 15 years ago. But I think this conversation is kind of discipline or domain agnostic, right? Because it can apply to art, animation, visual effects, software engineering, localization, QA. I mean, if there's an aspect of the game that that has human contribution, I mean there's opportunities to find partners to help us support those areas.
And speaking of a large spectrum of people being covered, the new report actually has a much larger scope than the previous reports, and mentioned this several times, that a large proportion of the companies covered in the report, it's their first time in the report. So do you think that the report is showing anything different, or do you think it has impacted the findings of the report, the fact that there's a much larger scope being covered this year?
My take on that was more that we're getting a really healthy cross-section of the industry. So there are significant developments going on just geopolitically in the world that affect business, COVID being first among them, but it's certainly not the only one. And so you've constantly got businesses opening up and either closing or being acquired, or surfacing or disappearing for a wide variety of reasons. The thing that I took away from the fact that there were so many different companies and so many different companies of different sizes participating in the report, I found really encouraging, because it means and we can back this up with data, that not all games are being developed by 5 giant studios, or there's all indie developers, and it's either like a 5-person team, a scrappy little team working out of some WeWork space, or Electronic Arts or Ubisoft. It's actually much more healthy across the board. So you do have tiny teams, you do have little indie games that are doing really well and they're participating in this report, but you've also got mid-sized companies of 10 to 15, 50 people, and then you also do have the much larger ones as well. So my take on the fact that so many new people were participating speaks to the health of the ecosystem in our business.
And I love the fact that it brings like new international perspectives from different locations and different cultures, because someone's approach or philosophies towards external development in, say, like Bogota could be very different from those in like Kuala Lumpur, for example. So to have those perspectives infused in the report, I think it speaks to the diversity of the information, the diversity of the data. It just makes it a stronger, richer report.
That's a great point.
Absolutely, I completely agree with both of you. And speaking of the report, I think it's time we talk about some of the findings from the report. And I think it's important to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is COVID. Dave, you briefly mentioned the impact of COVID. The CR has a complete new section on the impact of COVID. And what I found really interesting is that the COVID's impact on external development specifically was less than anticipated. So can you talk a little bit about why you guys think we saw less of an impact than we anticipated?
I'm happy to take that one. Sure, yeah. So I think that it was surprising in a good way, the degree to which our industry was able to rebound from the disruption that COVID caused. I mean, the transfer from sort of being in studio to work from home, both for service providers and for developers, was hugely disruptive in the same way that it was for every industry. I think the thing that was unexpected about what happened in games is just how quickly we were able to adapt, and just how quickly we were able to return to a development cycle where we're working really quickly and working successfully with other partners. It was really disruptive. I don't mean to suggest that it wasn't. And one of the things that we did see is that there was a significant number of service providers just don't report, just didn't show up for this year's report, maybe because they're not in business anymore. So we actually, there's sort of an invisible cohort of people involved in the report that just aren't there because maybe they're doing something different. That said, we've also seen our industry has really been fortunate in the fact that so many people have been spending so much more time gaming, and so demand for games has really shot up, and so as a result, there's more work for service providers, there's more work for developers, and there's just a lot more to do. So I would caution against saying that COVID wasn't disruptive. What I would characterize it more as, the games industry, both on the service provider side and on the developer side, has been pretty nimble, and even more so than even we were ourselves expecting, which I find sort of gratifying and exciting.
I'll to a certain degree echo what Dave was saying. I mean, to work in the games industry for any duration of time, like, you realize quickly, like, we are like a very like a highly adaptable species of worker, if you will, right? Because like change is just part of the nature of what we're dealing with. So constantly faced with new technologies, console transitions, shifting player demand, which then leads to project scope and schedule changes. So we're just, I don't know if you agree with me, Dave, like, we're just always used to being on our toes and getting kind of beat up in the best possible way. But yeah, I kind of agree that on the developer side, like, I mean, I think that the change was largely with like IT and security and legal, because I think how we sent out the work and receive it fundamentally didn't really change to a large degree. So once we got that infrastructure part in place, I think we were off to the races. But one of the challenges that we faced, and I don't know whether or not this is covered in the report, but like, for example, the service providers having to overnight send all of their folks home. And it's like, okay, well, we still have a project to get done. We still need those people to be productive, and we still need them to have network access and be able to send them builds. And so that was hugely challenging. So kudos to our IT and network folks that were able to get that stuff up and running. But we also had like security issues where, okay, now there's a worker at home and they have family around and they have a roommate around, and like they're working on proprietary stuff that hasn't even been announced, and hopefully something doesn't get posted up on Twitter. I mean, I didn't see many breaches, fortunately. Maybe you guys know of some. But anyways, coming back to Dave's point, I think we all adapted, quite well to the situation.
One of the things that I hope will stick with us from this period of this disruption is the willingness to work with folks around the world where perhaps previously there was more hesitation around working with sort of distributed teams. I mean, just to speak to my own team as an example, we are working with more people and more individuals around the world, including through ArtStation. So there are folks that we discovered through the use of that platform. And historically, we've always found that having people co-located really helps. Lord knows time zones are a tricky thing. I mean, I've got an interview at 2:30 in the morning 2 days from now to help coordinate between the UK and Shanghai. So it's going to get there are always going to be challenges that come with distributed folks. But I am, as a person who works in external development, I'm really grateful that there are more opportunities to work with more different kinds of people located around the world. I just think that's an exciting way to connect with folks who have localized expertise, and you get to work with the best people in the world.
Well,
that's really cool.
And on the flip side, Dave, those people in those countries, those regions, get an opportunity to work on potentially like massive AAA titles that would maybe never have otherwise had that opportunity without relocating to UK or Canada or US. So I think it provides those interesting, exciting opportunities as well.
I would absolutely agree. And Dave, I just hope your meeting goes well. That sounds horrible. 2:30 a.m. My God.
You're Superman.
And it's super, and to be super clear, nobody is saying that I need to be on that one, right? Like, I feel like I really kind of owe it to the excellent people that I work with. Like, nobody's saying I need to be there at 2:30 in the morning. That's on me. That's not on them. But I will say that trying to get folks on all sides of the planet working together live does present its share of challenges.
Communication in general was absolutely a focus of the report. I believe, yes, both service providers and publishers reported that communication was one of their concerns. So COVID, as Dave has showed us, is putting even more emphasis on communication right now. So what steps are you seeing, both either in your own companies, in your own jobs, and also just in the report in general? What steps are publishers, developers, service providers, are they taking to make sure communication stays effective even after the onset of COVID completely surprised everybody?
I think there are some tangible steps that have been taken and some that are a little bit more intangible but are still really important. So what I mean by that is tangible steps are things like all of a sudden everybody uses Zoom, where previously that wasn't a thing. And then you also see kind of the next layer above that where people are starting to look at virtual presence tools, or I mean, a great example of that would be all the work that Chris and his team have done to like host virtual conferences is a huge place where we used to use meeting in person as a driver of business and a way to meet new partners and to build trust and to kind of set up the relationships that were going to carry us through the development process of these games. So those are kind of where it's a lot of new tools being used. What I would also say is that the fact that so many people have been seeing each other in their homes has led to a level of empathy that I really hope stays with us, where you see people that it's actually like, now there's their kids, or there's their dog, or there's their, their bedroom, or whatever. Like, it's just, I wish it didn't require a disruption on this scale, but I do think one of the real benefits, one of the most striking things that I've noticed is the degree to which people are willing to see their external partners as human beings and as individuals. So it's not like the India team or the folks in Shanghai or whatever. It's like, you're knowing them individually and you're respecting them individually. And I think generally speaking, and this is, I'm speaking from my personal experience. I'm sure there's horror stories. I don't mean to suggest that there aren't, but my experience has been just a real willingness to treat each other with more respect and with more sympathy. Like, it's just, people have, kids popping up in the background, and that's okay. Like, people are, 5 minutes late because, like, the power went out, like, and that's okay. I think there's sort of, I hope one of the most lasting impacts of COVID on external development is just a general, right, raising of humanity in how we treat each other and how we work together.
Yeah, I would agree. Great points, Dave, on the tangible and intangible. On the intangible side, absolutely. Like we were just talking earlier, right, Jerry, about the increased scope and complexity of the work going at a house, and that requires like us. It's too bad we didn't have somebody from the service provider side part of this conversation, well, because they have so much to add. But it requires like us to really like dial up and be on point our level of communication with these partners. And I think I've seen a real desire on the developer side to kind of increase our level of what people now call, cultural intelligence, to maintain kind of an effective, effective communication and nurture stronger relationships. So, by cultural intelligence, that could mean, just having a better understanding and appreciation for other cultures in order to strengthen those relationships, so that when the shit hits the fan, a milestone is missed or work is behind schedule, that both parties have a really strong and solid bridge to stand on. And I feel like, again, as the work level is increasing in volume and complexity, that just becomes more and more important.
I find it really interesting that how you guys are describing it sounds like almost COVID, although it has made communication significantly harder, it has almost brought the humanity back in communicating between people, which just sounds like such a beautiful idea. And I completely agree with what you said, Dave. I hope it lasts after COVID secedes. And now, going to what else the report has covered, something that I found really concerning is that the report said publishers are seeing more demand. They want to make more content, as we discussed earlier, but they're also seeing a lack of capacity in service providers. And not only that, both service providers and publishers are agreeing in that a lack of top talent is a big concern for both of them. It's almost like there is a supply not equal to the demand. There's not a supply of talent big enough for the demand of content that the world wants right now. So, one, why do you think we are seeing this trend, this pattern occurring? And two, what are the steps that we can take to fix it?
Well, I think it's occurring largely because, and especially in the last, I don't know the time, I want to say like maybe 6 to 8 months, especially with the console transition that happened, late last year with Xbox and Sony PlayStation, as well as we're seeing, online streaming services that are also considered new platforms that we have to support. So again, it's more content, it's more complex content, it's more platforms. I think that's leading to a real what's the term? All this work is starting to be jammed through a funnel because there just aren't enough service providers out there to do this work. I'll also say, maybe a little pat on our back, I think we've done a good job at XDS, like spreading the gospel for the advantages of like why you should be leveraging external services. And I think we've probably seen more developers going down that path as a result. I don't know if maybe we're our own worst enemy as a result of that. I don't know. What do you think, Dave?
I think there's a few things going on. I think there's a pretty clear supply problem, in the sense that, if you want to work with really excellent people, there is a finite number of them, and there is an increasingly large demand for those people, and so they are both being courted by developers themselves and the service providers who are then trying to serve those developers. So they're pulling from the same pool. So they're that competition is expressing itself both on the service provider side and on the developer side. However, I think it's also really important to note that a lot of the things that used to be the province of game development almost exclusively have started to spread into other industries. So real-time pipelines is a great example of this. So like if you think of something like, people are watching The Mandalorian is a great example of this, right? So they're using real-time game engine technology to produce their visual effects. And so all of a sudden, you're looking for people who perhaps used to work primarily in games, or people who used to work primarily in film and television are starting to become part of the same pool. And all of a sudden, we're not just competing against other game developers for talent or other game developers and other service providers for talent. We're competing with Disney and Netflix. And then it gets even more like significant beyond that, where other huge industries are getting into using the same technologies that the game developers do. So like automotive or medical technologies, where like all of a sudden the number of people desired is growing, not just because games is growing, and games are growing quickly, but there's also this sort of secondary layer of like huge new people coming in seeking talent. So I mean, I think from if I was earlier in my career and going on that art path, the number of options available to me is expanding dramatically, and all the more so because it's more global. So if you can work from anywhere for anyone, there's just going to be a massive supply problem because there is effectively bottomless demand. And so I think if I was somebody who is building up their ArtStation page, start learning real-time visual effects, because if you know any good ones, send them my way.
I'll add one interesting knock-on effect of the scarcity issue that we saw in the report this year is that you've got service providers that traditionally only partnered with their clients, with their developers and publishers to do the work. Now service providers are actually working with other service providers and partnering and enable with the ability to spread that work across multiple companies. So now I might go to my preferred service provider and say, hey, those 10 animators that you had available, love to put them on a project. And that company would say, actually, sorry, another service provider just booked up those resources. So now we're actually competing with other service providers for those resources. And that's a new phenomenon of the last, I'd say, year and a half.
That's so fascinating. What you guys are discussing about the skills used in game design being used everywhere, it was actually mirrored in an interview we had with Mark Petit, who is at Unreal Engine, talking about Unreal Engine 5. He was talking about exactly very similar things, where Unreal Engine can be used in so many different platforms, so many different purposes. Not only that, but the same Unreal Engine file can be used across all those different places. I mean, it's an amazing time to be in this industry. And for people who are interested in learning real-time, there's ArtStation Learning with tutorials and lessons about so much of these things. Go to artstation.com for more information about that. But we're running low on time. I do want to look towards the future, though. In future XDS reports, and I know this is a hard question to ask, but are there questions you want answered? Are there places you want the future XDS reports to cover or look at?
So I think, and Dave and I may have similar or different ideas on this one, but obviously we've nailed scarcity of talent on the head in this conversation. By the time we do the next report, that'll be the end of this calendar year. So I want to see, how have developers and service providers adapted to that scarcity? What's been the real impact? That's one for me. And then the other one, I mean, although, with the pandemic, things might be going well in certain countries and certain regions, in others, not so much. So I think it's still important to take a snapshot of where we're at with the pandemic again at the end of this year, and again see what the impact is, how people are adapting to that.
For me, I mean, the things that interest me most are often the gap between expectation and reality. And so an example from this year's report is that there is a huge amount of anxiety both on service providers and amongst developers of market consolidation. So like mergers, acquisitions, there's this perception of fewer service providers and fewer buyers. So fewer people selling stuff and fewer people buying stuff, and that's making it hard for me to sell. But when we look at the data, that isn't borne out. And in fact, that feeling is a symptom of something different, which is that it is increasingly able to connect with the new people. There are new service providers, there are new developers, but like the way that we usually connect with them, like through conferences, don't exist anymore. So now we can't see the new people. So how do we find the new work? And so now all we're doing is seeing like the latest report about how X game company has acquired other X game company, and now all my customers have disappeared. So I give that as an example of the kind of thing I find interesting. So to address your question of like the kinds of things I'd like to ask in the next year's report, there's sort of two big ones. The first is COVID specifically. When we started working on this year's report was really just as the pandemic was really reaching kind of a fever pitch. We put the survey together, and while the pandemic was really gathering steam, and then the responses were coming in sort of the winter of last year. And so it was really important to us that we get just a baseline of perception. Like because we didn't really have a lot of data of like what is the new normal, of like what is the legacy of this thing. But it was really important to us to just put a line in the sand so that we could compare the 2022 report to like what do people think was going to happen. So if we can look back and compare what people think is going to happen, what actually did, that I find really interesting. So like that's a very long-winded way of saying I'm really looking forward to asking everybody the same questions we did last year about COVID and seeing where things lined up and where things changed. The other thing that I'm really curious to see is this is the first year that we've started collecting data on inclusion and diversity statistics, in particular of just like the degree to which different service providers and different developers are holding that as something that's important to them and how they produce video games and how they work. For me personally, it's the thing that I care very deeply about, and I want to continue to make that a priority in how we think about how games are made, and how we think about the products we consume are made is the people who make them, and so anything we can do to really kind of zero in on that kind of information and prioritizing that kind of information, I think kind of underscores what I was saying at the very beginning of this, which is more humanity, more caring about the people that are actually making these products, not just people that are making them, or not just the people that are playing them. I think is all to the good.
I think that everybody in this industry is very passionate about what they do. Even if you're not an artist, if you are like you, Chris and Dave, you're more on the managing side, you're more on connecting people. Everyone's passionate. So Dave, I really hope you are correct. And I really hope that we do see more humanity coming in. And I would be very curious to see the future reports. Sadly, we are all out of time. But for our audience, if you'd like to read the entire report, it has so much more than we were able to cover in this 30 minutes. Go to xdssummit.com. Also, it's more information about XDS 2021, again, taking place between September 14th, September 17th. Don't forget to check out ArtStation.com. There you can find ArtStation Learning. It is free until the end of 2021. It's an amazing deal. You can get so many free tutorials and lectures on a wide range of topics. Make sure to check it out now at artstation.com/learning. Speaking of external development, ArtStation has recently launched ArtStation Studio. It is an all-in-one place where you can find studios to collaborate and list your own as well. For more information about it, go to artstation.com/studios. Links to all of this and more are in the description below. Thank you again for watching. I'm your host, Jerry Orrs, signing off. Bye.